am the Reverend Jan Hutzler, and I have the great privilege of being the minister here at the UU Congregation of the Upper Valley. I also had the great honor of working with the other 3 UU congregations in the Upper Valley to create this event. Thank you for coming. Wow, I am so encouraged and heartened to see so many people here on behalf of the earth. May we gather our spirits, may we gather our energy, our ideas, our creativity, and work for action on behalf of the earth. And now I have the great honor of introducing my friend and my colleague, Leon Dunkley, Reverend Leon Dunkley.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. They say the most radical thing we can do is to introduce ourselves to one another. So at a time of great crisis, being able to look around at familiar faces and find ease and peace and relaxation and quieting, settling, centering is a super important thing. My name is Leon Dunkley. I'm the minister. I serve North Universalist Chapel Society over in Woodstock, Vermont. I wanted to highlight some of the artists who are contributing to today's events. First, I want to highlight the work of Joan Columbus, whose work Sorrow for the Earth is so beautiful and was the sort of centrally featured piece of art on our programs. Joan's right here. Could you please come? She's right here being shy, so but I'm pointing to her. No, I'm just kidding. I also wanted to show the work of Bram Ort, whose collage is called The Earth is on Fire. Depicts the science and the effects of CO2 emissions and the rising global temperatures. And it's right here. And Bram is right here with us today. There are also examples of 350 million year old tree stem fossils, which are here. Can I pick them up? Is that okay for the... Okay. And there are other pieces. So we've been here for a while. Us being we who live on this earth in the broadest possible way. So as we move forward today, just let us keep the consciousness of those who came before and those who will come after us. It's now my great honor to introduce our colleague, Reverend Paul Sawyer from Heartland.
My name is Paul Sawyer, and I serve the Universalist Society of Heartland. And it's a joy to be with you, and on behalf of our congregation, I rejoice to welcome you all. And I get to highlight some of the organizational leaders and representatives that are here that are sharing information. They have some materials in the hallway, and you can chat with them over the course of the day to get a sense of what different organizations are working on. And I'm gonna name some folks, and I'm gonna ask if you can in this space to stand briefly. I put them in alphabetical order in terms of their organization, in case you're trying to figure out like who comes first. That's all it is. So Bruce Freeberg and Tom Trunso are part of the Climate Change Regional Academy sponsored by Vital Communities. You can stand up, Bruce. Laurel Stevenson and Simon Dennis are here representing Extinction Rebellion. Linda Gray is chair of the Norwich Energy Committee. Evan Oxen is chair of the Plainfield, Oxenham, the chair of the Plainfield Energy Committee. Ariel Arwin is here representing the Sierra Club. And Ron McGarvey, who's president of Vermont Interfaith Power and Light. leaders in those organizations and to you all, and I have the joy of introducing my dear colleague, Reverend Telos Whitfield.
Welcome, everyone. We have been planning this event for a couple of months, anyways, a few months, and I think it was a vision that's been happening for a long time, and we were hoping to have this kind of a group, a crowd, but oh my gosh. I mean, take a minute to look around, right? And if you ever doubt or ever feel that you're alone in this justice work, in holding up, in caring for our dear earth, no way, come on. It's beautiful. So Marissa Mizuko and I, we're going to offer a little worship time. And so
the womb of stars. The womb of stars embraces us, remnants of their fiery furnaces pulses through our veins.
We are of the stars, the dust of the explosions cast across space.
We are of the earth. We breathe and live in the breath of ancient plants and beasts.
Their cells nourish the soil. We build our communities on their harvests of gifts.
Our fingers trace the curves carved in clay and stone by our forebears, unknown to us.
We are part of the great circle of humanity gathered around the fire, the hearth, the altar.
We gather anew this day to celebrate our common heritage.
May we recall in gratitude all that has given us birth.
Joy Atkinson. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us.
And now if you would join in singing, Come, Come, Whoever You Are. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. We are going to take a few minutes to express our gratitude for our dear earth. The ministers, my dear friends and colleagues, are going to call the 4 directions. And as you hear the call for each direction, we can look at Joan's beautiful painting. Spirit of the East, spirit of air, of morning and springtime, be with us as the sun rises in times of beginning, times of planting. Inspire us with a fresh breath of courage as we go forth into new adventures.
Spirit of the South, spirit of fire, of noontime and summer, be with us through the heat of the day and help us to be ever growing, warm us with strength and energy for the work that awaits us.
Spirit of West, Spirit of water, of evening and autumn, be with us as the sun sets, and help us enjoy a rich harvest. Flow through us with a cooling, healing quietness, and bring us peace.
Spirit of the North, Spirit of this sacred essential moment now, Spirit of earth, of nighttime and winter, be with us in the darkness in this time of gestation.
Each of us that has made our way here, I feel, is called to act. And the first act you did today was to get yourselves here. Nice work. Good work. And you can feel, I know I can, the power of community. We have multiple faith communities and organizations and individuals here from the Upper Valley and beyond. So feel that power. And when you're home tonight, continue to feel that power around you. None of us is alone in this work. We're called to come together. We're called to act on behalf of our dear earth. And we know we can feel the power of community of 2 or 3 or 10 or 150 of us. With our wisdom, our voices, our hands, our hearts, we recommit to the work of repairing and restoring and honoring the earth. We commit in courageous and intimate and beautiful and difficult ways to combating climate change. Let us remember who or what or how we were called to this work. It is sacred work. Those memories, those people, those instances, those experiences can be our inspiration and our strength. If you would sing with us, sing and rejoice. Sing and rejoice, sing and rejoice. May all things living now sing and rejoice. Sing and rejoice, sing and rejoice. May all things living now sing and rejoice. Sing and rejoice, sing and rejoice. May all things living now sing and rejoice. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to my colleague and friend, Reverend Tom Kinder. So, yay!
I am the pastor of the United Church of Stratford, and there are many people from our congregation here, strong contingent. I had the honor of introducing Jim Antal in a similar setting 10 months ago. And at the time I was reading his book, Climate Church, Climate World, for the second time. I've since read it a third, and I go back to it often because I need to. As I said last March, this is exactly the book that spiritual communities need. Exactly the book. And that means that it is exactly the book the world needs. Because as Jim's good friend, Gus Speth, says, the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. Elsewhere, Gus calls it the rise of a new consciousness is what we need. Jim Antal's book is a roadmap to help spiritual communities speed that cultural and spiritual transformation. Jim could not have talked the talk we need if he had not walked the walk. As Bill McKibben says in the introduction to Jim's book, as long as there has been a serious climate movement in the United States, Jim Antal has been at the forefront. The world owes him a mighty thanks, and so do we. So that's what I said a year ago. A year ago, I'd be done now. But now I need to praise Jim more highly, and I need to speak to our situation more urgently. In the past year, Jim has traveled tirelessly, carrying his message around the country, and he has been extraordinarily generous with his time locally. And he continues to exude hope, encouragement, and joy, which is just truly amazing and beautiful. I feel overwhelming gratitude for his ongoing ministry and for his friendship. So, our urgent need of Jim's work has also increased. Over the past year, we have learned that the crisis is already far worse than we thought, and that we have less time than we thought to prevent the worst. We've learned this over the past year, 8 years at most, as Greta reminds us. We've also learned that the people who are profiting from the climate crisis are not giving up. In fact, they are fighting harder to do even more damage to the earth. They and their supporters in the church and in the culture see themselves literally at war with any who would try to stop them, meaning us. Scientific reports will not change them. Record-breaking floods and wildfires will not change them. The largest week of protest in the history of the world, 7 million strong, will not change them. As Bill McKibben wrote in his recent book, Falter, only a sustained global nonviolent movement will have the power to bring the needed change. Thich Nhat Hanh said the same thing in 2013 in an interview. He cited the tactics used by Gandhi, but he insisted that this can be effective only if activists first deal with their own anger and fear. Nhat Hanh said, Gandhi knew how to take care of himself during nonviolent operations. He knew how to preserve energy because the struggle is long. So spiritual practice is very much needed in an attempt to help change society. Now, Gandhi's movement had 3 dimensions. The smallest is the one that we all know. It's the best known. The strikes, the fasts, the marches, called obstructive program. It's what Joanna Macy in her great book, Act of Hope, calls holding actions. That's the smallest. Constructive program, which Macy describes as creating new life-sustaining systems and practices. That's where Gandhi's movement expended most of its energy and most of its time. But the third dimension was education, spiritual practice, and personal transformation, working toward that shift of consciousness. And that was the heart and soul of the movement, and it was done every day. Churches can help lead and equip people in all 3 of these dimensions. And we need to devote our energy toward creating this kind of movement for cultural and spiritual transformation in our communities today. One movement that brings together social justice and environmental causes, both by addressing the selfishness and greed that are behind them all, and by creating solutions like the Green New Deal that embrace them all. We do not have a moment to lose. So now I say even more strongly, Climate Church, Climate World is exactly the book we need, because this is all in there. And Jim Antal is the positive voice and visionary we need to help us repurpose our churches for this 3-dimensional, nonviolent struggle. So let us listen to Jim and let us commit to work together without ceasing. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Jim.
It's really something to stand here and to look out at this crowd. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to urge you, do not forget what you're feeling right now. You will need the energy that is available to you right now, the energy that's immediately available to you right now. You're going to need it as you begin to experience God calling you to take whatever action your life has prepared you to take over the next weeks and months. And know that when you take those actions, we will be taking those actions together, not as individuals. And as my friend Bill McKibben says, we need to stop being individuals. And that's what we're doing right now. We are not here as individuals. We have stopped being individuals, and we have come together. Now, I could go on and on like this, but I bring a text because otherwise I have no idea where I'll go. And I hope in what I have to say in this prepared text that different parts of it will appeal to different ones of you. I am certain, because I know several people in the room, that there's stuff I'm going to say that you already know. That's fine. I hope I say some stuff that's new for everybody who's here. Before, just let me give you a little bit of my background. I do actually have a formal title. I've retired from leading the United Church of Christ in Massachusetts, which I did for 12 years. But a year and a half ago, I settled with my wife in Norwich, Vermont, where I've been retired. I have to put the quotation marks on there because my title is Special Advisor to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ nationally on climate justice. And so I go all over the country speaking to groups like this, but I don't really have the words to express what it's like. This is a homecoming for me, because Norwich is our home now, and it's our new home. And for most of you, this area is something you're very familiar with. I'm still getting to know it on the gravelly roads on my gravel bike as I ride it in 3 seasons, not in the wintertime. So it's just to look out in your face is deeply moving for me. I want you to know just a bit about my background. Full disclosure, my father was the head chemical engineer for Mobil Oil. So in the late 1950s, when I was 8 or 9 years old, I was hearing about the Canadian tar sands as the largest or second largest oil repository in the world. When I was 8 or 9 years old, talking with my dad about this, and he said, he was a chemical engineer, he said it will never be recovered because it will never be economical to extract that oil from shale. If he had been a mechanical engineer, he might have imagined horizontal drilling, which came in the mid-'80s. And that's why ExxonMobil and all the others are not energy companies. The reason they are not energy companies, which is what they all contemplated in the late 70s, the reason they remain oil companies is because they developed the technology to frack. And that's why anti-fracking is such an important movement, one of the many reasons why. I've also provided an outline of my presentation. Feel free to take notes on it. It'll help you follow along. And on the back of that outline are several questions. Those of you that are active members in whatever congregation of whatever faith orientation you are, I think you'll find those questions a helpful follow-up to what we're going to do here this afternoon. So let me begin by talking about the situation that God has called us to. A world in which climate change is no longer a future event, but it's happening right now. As we all know, Australia is engulfed in flames. The part of Australia that has burned is larger than the state of West Virginia, and over 1 billion animals have been killed. Drought is now measured in decades, not in months. Rainfall from big storms is now measured in feet, not in inches. In August 2019, Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas was the longest siege of violent, destructive weather ever observed. Since 1950, the number of floods across the world has increased by 15 times, and extreme temperature events by 20 times, and wildfires by 7-fold. But actually, that's an old stat. Now with Australia, I'm sure it's many more times than that. The temperatures would be a lot hotter if it weren't for the oceans. Oceans absorb over 93% of the heat humans create. And we now know that the oceans are warming at a rate 40% faster than we thought they were only 5 years ago. As the oceans absorb CO2, the oceans are becoming more acidic at a frightening rate, in excess of anything the oceans have seen in 300 million years. On a larger scale, the Earth's temperature is already well into the range that existed during the Eemian period 120,000 years ago, when sea level was 20 to 30 feet higher than it is today. So that's what's already, as they say, baked in. And finally, there are about 10 million plant and animal species in the world today, and 1 million of them are now at risk of extinction. Truly, we are in the midst of an unprecedented emergency. So now I want to name 5 broad ethical concerns that will help you understand why people of faith, as Tom said, must engage this issue. Many fail to understand the first broad ethical concern, that climate change is an injustice multiplier and accelerator. Let me spell that out for you. Climate change multiplies and accelerates injustice in at least 3 ways. First, the climate change is hitting the poorest and people of color first and worst. It's the poorest people who live in areas most likely to flood, most prone to disease, most subject to droughts, heat waves, and various diseases that are now migrating as a consequence of climate change. And here in America, our inner cities have a health crisis that gets worse each summer. As temperatures rise, more and more cases of asthma are disabling and killing children and elderly people of color. The second injustice is that those most affected by climate change did not cause it and are powerless to stop it. For example, the farmers in parts of Africa who are losing their lands either to drought or to unprecedented flooding, they have a carbon footprint 1/200th the size of the average American. And the third injustice is that people and institutions who actually caused and are causing climate change aren't paying for the reparations for the catastrophic damage climate change is already causing. Not only that, but here in the US, this is important, we actually subsidize fossil fuel companies to the tune of $25 billion a year. That's your tax dollars. The second broad ethical concern associated with climate change is humanity's inadequate focus on and acceptance of intergenerational responsibility. I'll say more about that in a moment. The third broad ethical concern associated with climate change focuses on our relationship and attitude toward nature. With the exception of indigenous cultures, humanity regards nature as a treasure trove for exploitation. As Ta-Nehisi Coates points out in his book Between the World and Me, over the past few centuries, we have enslaved the earth. Over the past 200 years, we have built the modern world by exploiting resources nature took 150 million years to make. There is no difference between our exploitation of black bodies and our exploitation of the earth. To me, it's unthinkable that the major world religions have developed over the past several thousand years in a way that seems to be okay with the idea of owning nature. If you're interested in dealing with that in a Q&A after my talk, I'm more than glad to go into that in more detail. A fourth broad ethical concern raised by climate change is the need for a new understanding of fiduciary accountability. I won't ask for a show of hands of how many accountants are in the audience, but many of you have accountants, so listen up. Let's not forget that as people of faith, it's our forebears in the faith who introduced the notion of fiduciary and fiduciary responsibility. It means keeping faith with. The current understanding of fiduciary allows for the directors of companies to claim the moral and legal high ground when all they do is to maximize short-term monetary profit for their shareholders. For centuries, the church has ceded to the legal and investment world the exclusive right to interpret society's understanding of fiduciary responsibility. I believe it is both crazy and criminal to think that an investment advisor has satisfied his or her fiduciary obligation by assuring maximum financial profit over the next quarter while ignoring the fact that that investment will wreck the home of the investor. I'm not alone in this view. As I discuss in my book, former Securities and Exchange Commissioner Beavis Longstreet, that's the award for the best name of the day, okay? Right? Beavis Longstreet, real name. He is in agreement with me. If you're interested, we can talk more about that in Q&A. A fifth broad ethical issue is the short-term time horizon that dominates both investment practices as well as political agendas. Humanity needs to follow moral principles that take seriously the fact that for the past many decades, we have acted in ways that have consequences for centuries and probably eons to come. So now I want to focus for a few minutes on vocation. In a time such as this, I'm excerpting that quote from the 4th chapter of the book of Esther in the Hebrew Scriptures. In a time such as this, what is your personal calling? What is the vocation of your faith community? Does humanity itself have a vocation? From my point of view, the challenge before us compels us to go to a deep place. Everywhere I speak, I find people are longing to hear candid, unalloyed truth, especially in response to their two most frequent questions. What can I do? What can one person do about this problem? And what can our congregation do that would make a difference? And as it turns out, we've been born at a time when the continuity of creation, it's coming undone. We're living on the hinge of history. We're the first generation to foresee and the final generation with an opportunity to forestall the most devastating consequences of climate change. So as we begin to consider vocation in a time of climate crisis, as we attend to God's call to write a new story, what are the qualities we need to nurture and develop? Courage. Courage is the first quality. Courage is no longer optional. It's required. Let me illustrate the courage that is required of us by reading a brief passage from my book. Listen for how it illustrates the enormously persuasive power religious leaders can have if they have the courage to speak out and put their lives on the line. This passage begins on page 51. The discontinuity created by the Nazi rise to power prompted Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel to speak out. In March 1938, just before Hebrew Union College brought him to America, Heschel addressed a group of Quakers in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. He titled his brief talk, "The Meaning of This Hour." Consider how much of what Heschel had to say about his own time applies just as well to our situation today. We have profaned the Word of God, and we have given the wealth of our land, the ingenuity of our minds, and the dear lives of our youth to tragedy and perdition. There has never been more reason for man to be ashamed than now. We have bartered holiness for convenience, loyalty for success, love for power, wisdom for information, tradition for fashion. Let the blasphemy of our time not become an eternal scandal. Let future generations not loathe us for having failed to preserve what prophets and saints, martyrs and scholars have created over thousands of years. God is waiting for us to redeem the world. We should not spend our lives hunting for trivial satisfactions while God is waiting constantly and keenly for our effort and devotion. The Almighty has not created the universe that we may have opportunities to satisfy our greed, envy, and ambition. Heschel concludes with this challenge. The mountain of history is over us again. Shall we renew our covenant with God? This provocative question echoes through the generations as it challenges the church leaders of today. The tragic consequences of ignoring this question are described in a letter written to a pastor in the city of Bonn, Germany, shortly after World War II ended, by a then little-known Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer had just been released from a concentration camp. A short while later, he would become the first post-war chancellor of West Germany. Adenauer writes his pastor friend, "I believe that if all the bishops had together made public statements from the pulpits on a particular day, they could have prevented a great deal. But that did not happen, and there is no excuse for it. It would have been no bad thing if the bishops had all been put in prison or in concentration camps as a result. Quite the contrary. But none of that happened, and therefore it is best to keep quiet." Serving as a denominational leader in a time of profound systemic injustice and increasing discontinuity, I am convinced that God is calling people of faith to speak with a clear, bold, truthful, and prophetic voice in this time of climate crisis. Urgency. Urgency is the second quality, and no one communicates that urgency better than now 17-year-old Greta Thunberg. She's now, her birthday was January 3rd, by the way. She's been focused on climate change since she was 8. In August 2018, she embraced a new vocation. She initiated the school strike for climate. First, it was only her out in front of the Swedish parliament, and after a few months, tens of thousands of other students throughout Europe joined her. Last March, she spoke to the richest people in the world. Greta did not fly to Davos. She doesn't do that. She took the ferry over to the mainland and it took a 33-hour train ride. And when she arrived at Davos, she was greeted by the host saying, "Oh, you are our honored guest. We have a suite for you." And she said, "No thanks, I brought my tent." And she slept outside in the frigid cold Switzerland cold. But when she came inside, this is what she said. "We must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. I don't want your hope. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act on it as if your house were on fire. I want you to act on it as if your house were on fire, because it is." Her unrelenting focus and undiluted truthfulness has inspired millions. On September 18th, she offered the the House Ways and Means Committee her "I Have a Dream" speech. Imagine a 16-year-old standing in front of the most powerful committee in America's Congress with the gumption to offer a "I have a dream" speech. Listen to it. I have a dream that people in power, as well as the media, start treating this crisis like the existential emergency it is. In fact, I have many dreams. But this is the year 2019. This is not the time and the place for dreams. This is the time to wake up. And yet wherever I go, I seem to be surrounded by fairy tales. Elected officials make up bedtime stories to soothe us, to make us go back to sleep. The problem is we need to wake up. It's time to face the reality, the facts, the science. This is above all an emergency. And not just any emergency, it's the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced, and we need to react accordingly. 2 weeks later, she told the leaders of the world at the UN General Assembly, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions?" But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now is where we draw the line. The world is waking up and change is coming whether you like it or not. So the challenge of climate change is no less urgent than when the world faced fascism. And so it may be helpful to remember something from that era. If Franklin Delano Roosevelt had met with Edsel Ford in 1939 and said to Edsel Ford, "Edsel, listen, I want you to build me a manufacturing complex, okay? The biggest one in the world, all right? And in that manufacturing complex, I want you to make something that you've never made before, not a car or anything like that, all right? Something with over 1 million parts. And I'd like you to wrap that up within the next 6 months so that you could produce one of these things every 24 hours. Edsel, do you think you could do that for me?" Edsel Ford would have said, "Mr. President, you are out of your mind." But in 1941, everything had changed. And when FDR asked Edsel Ford to do that, Edsel Ford said, "Yes, sir." And 6 months later, the Willow Run manufacturing complex was completed, and a B-24 Liberation bomber was rolling out of that manufacturing complex every 24 hours. And those bombers have 1.2 million parts. So if the alarm of World War II can prompt the largest industry in America to willingly and urgently redirect its resources and change its business plan, then it's up to our generation to muster the courage that climate change requires of us to create a new story. A story so powerful that we can hasten the day when every human heart is governed not by grief, but by hope, not by constraint, but by generosity, not by selfishness, but by sharing. If courage and urgency are the first two qualities we must embrace, the third quality is scale. The scale of the challenge is enormous, and so are the solutions that are all available today. The Green New Deal demonstrates all three of these qualities: courage, urgency, and scale. That's why last June, the United Church of Christ and the Unitarian General Assembly, independent of each other, both endorsed the Green New Deal. And let's remember why a future without fossil fuel is even possible. God's great gift of creation, what I like to call the original Green New Deal, God's great gift of creation offers clean, renewable energy on an almost unimaginable scale. So keeping in mind the qualities of courage, urgency, and scale, let me suggest now several themes of the new story God is calling us to create as we embrace a new vocation. The first theme is that we need to make our houses of worship safe enough and relevant enough so that we can do three things. First, we need to talk about climate change when we gather as people of faith. Second, we need to hear each other's testimony. What if we added a monthly or maybe even a weekly 2-minute testimony to our worship services in which a member of the church who was pregnant or their partner would share a brief response to this question? In a world with a threatened future, what does it mean that we can bear and raise children? We need a safe enough place that a pregnant woman could stand up or her partner could stand up and respond to that. Third, we need to process our grief. And by doing so, we will empower one another to take action as we re-engage this long emergency. In a time such as this, we must acknowledge that the continuity of creation upon which thousands of generations of humans have sought moral progress, that continuity is over. And one thing more, we must recognize that the existential dread we experience can serve as a precondition of hope. Once we have a safe context in which we can share our dread with trusted friends, by the grace of God, the Holy Spirit will ignite in us a tenacious and defiant hope. Now, the next two themes emerged from a 2017 UCC resolution that I authored. The first is that pastors need to preach about climate change. And my guess is that most of the congregations represented here, that's already the case, but there are a whole lot of congregations where it isn't, and you all could be talking to your friends who go to those congregations and begin to exert the necessary bottom-up pressure that will get those pastors to begin to do that. The other theme that was central to the 2017 UCC Synod resolution is that we need to resist fossil fuel infrastructure. 2 days ago, when I was up at the State House with Gus and Cameron and many others of you, one of the demands by the Extinction Rebellion of our governor here in Vermont was to end all new fossil fuel infrastructure. I was arrested twice at the governor's office in Massachusetts when I was a resident in Massachusetts, attempting to make that same demand. It's an executive order. They can do that. They have that power. The time is now. But we need to extract that from them. It's up to us to make them do it, as Obama once said about this same topic. Let me offer an important and helpful way to think about the action we need to take. We need to take action on the supply side as well as on the demand side. So all of you are already taking action on the demand side, right? We compost, we turn down the heat and air conditioning. Some of us fly less, more of us need to do that. What about trading in your car for an electric bike? I won't ask for a show of hands. As for the supply side, though, one supply side action would be to join with others to block any new proposed fossil fuel infrastructure. All over the country, people are using their expertise, their connections, and their bodies to prevent unnecessary new pipelines and compressor stations, such as in Weymouth, Massachusetts, and LNG terminals from being built. They're also accelerating the shutdown of expensive, unneeded coal power plants. So far, 302 coal power plants have been shut down. Thanks be to God. There's still one in New Hampshire. And I want to talk about that. You've probably heard the reports over the last few months of folks like you and me, because I know who these folks are, they're personal friends of mine, who have stood on the railroad tracks in Worcester, Massachusetts, Ayer, Massachusetts, and Harvard, Massachusetts, in order to block the coal train from heading up to Bow, New Hampshire, where that coal-fired power plant is. If you all want to talk more about that, we can do that during Q&A. Here's a fourth theme. For years I've said from hundreds of pulpits across the country that we need to make civil disobedience a normative expression of faithful discipleship. Every bit as much as prayer. If you were to ask anybody in your congregation, gee, do you pray regularly? Everybody in church would say, well, of course I do. Duh. Well, you know what? We've been given bodies. And you don't have to read Gandhi to know that bodies can be useful in standing in the way of evil. Right? So for thousands of years, faith communities have encouraged their members to express their conscience on important public issues. For thousands of years, nonviolent civil disobedience has been one expression of faithful witness to religious values when those values come into conflict with the law of the land. Many Christians are not aware that after Jesus' death, Peter and Paul spent more time in jail than they spent out of jail. How about that, huh? And why? Well, it was because they were acting in service of the church that was waiting to be born, which is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to act in service of a world that is waiting to be born. It's time for faith communities to affirm their role in supporting those called by their conscience to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. Or to put it another way, it's time for people of faith to tell the truth about how industrial civilization is ending nature as humanity exercises our hubris. It's time for people of faith to testify to an understanding of God that is not undone by the undoing of nature. Among other things, such testimony will certainly create the conditions for civil disobedience to become a normative expression of faithfulness. Many consider Henry David Thoreau as the first to identify civil disobedience as a strategy. But in his book, The Sacrament of Civil Disobedience, John Deere points out that pretty much everything Jesus did, including the resurrection, violated the law in the name of higher moral values. Greenpeace got started when a person of conscience decided to sail his boat to an atoll in the South Pacific where the U.S. was planning to detonate another atmospheric nuclear bomb on that island. And it was Greenpeace that actress Jane Fonda consulted as she prepared for Fire Drill Fridays, getting arrested in front of the White House every Friday. In an interview last month, her call for widespread nonviolent civil disobedience echoed what I wrote in my book 2 years ago. Our economic, corporate, and political systems, our lifestyles and aspirations are all tied up to an unsustainable expectation of material growth. For 200 years, this juggernaut has been powered by fossil fuel. If we are to untie this Gordian knot, if we are to overcome this inertia, ordinary people, motivated by faith and conscience, must regularly interrupt business as usual to draw attention to where we are headed and to offer a better way. The Extinction Rebellion in Vermont and elsewhere is now leading, one of the leaders certainly in that effort. The Sunrise Movement is one of the leaders in that effort. It's really up to us as people connected with congregations to go to them and say, how can we help? Here's a fifth theme for the new story God is calling us to create as we embrace a new vocation. I'm encouraging congregations to become Acts 2:42 congregations by valuing the common good above personal economic benefit. A first step is to undertake new behaviors in the following areas and understand your change in behavior as a spiritual discipline, as Tom Kinder was suggesting. We can shop, eat, drive, share, spend, fly, use energy, recycle, and more. And we can find new ways to do that, again, understanding those new things as a spiritual discipline and talk with each other about it. We can also consider providing for one another rides, finding jobs for one another, sharing each other's car or lawnmower, helping each other to conserve. This is part of the circular economy, or the donut economy, that different writers and other people in this room know more about than I do. Let me give you a sixth theme. We need to reevaluate the land that our houses of worship occupy. I can tell you there's a few congregations in Massachusetts that have asked that question. We always think of our building as our major asset, or we think of our people as our major asset, but we also have land. Most congregations have land, and that's like a aha for so many congregations. And there are two congregations in Massachusetts that now have permaculture gardens, large permaculture gardens occupying their land, and as a consequence, they've become a magnet for secular people who are gardeners from the town, who never thought they would darken the door of a church, to come to church and start gardening there, and God knows what happens after that, right? That's so here's a seventh theme. We need to reevaluate our congregations' investments, at least those congregations that have investments. The National United Church of Christ has been a leader in this movement. In 2012, Bill McKibben wrote the first article on divestment, and I can tell you, having known him from many years before that and during that time, that he never imagined how the divestment movement would take off. I sacrificed my Thanksgiving vacation in 2012 to write a resolution for our national church that was highly debated. It was covered by 250 different newspapers throughout the country, when 76% of the United Church of Christ delegates at our national meeting voted to divest from fossil fuels. And as a consequence, if you look at the listing of all of the institutional divestors on the website that I have a footnote for, at least in this talk and also in my book, what you'll find is that 26% of the institutions that have divested are faith communities. How about that? And the total number of money, the total amount of investments that has purged itself of fossil fuel stocks is now $12 trillion. It's just unbelievable. And that's why, as Tom suggested in his introduction, that's why the fossil fuel companies, I'll give you a quote, one specific example. In 2018, this is more or less 2 years ago, Shell, in its annual report, said the divestment movement constitutes a material threat. That's technical terms that it's like you're really talking turkey when you use the word material threat to our bottom line, to our business plan. That's one of the themes, if you will, that congregations have to undertake. And here's a final theme for the new story that God is calling us to create. Imagine if all houses of worship were to embrace this new story that God is calling us to create. Imagine if half the members were to publicly pledge at least 10% of their time to work on climate change. Imagine if those members began to leverage their influence and their personal assets to promote the policies and initiate the actions that we have reviewed with the kind of urgency that the science demands. Imagine if each one of you, imagine if all of us were to call in all of our chits. You all know what I'm talking about. It's really an unimaginable. Like, what do you call in all of your chits for? How about the preservation of the future? How about your grandchildren? Imagine if all of us were to call in all of our chits, and leverage all of our connections and influence. Imagine what an impact that would make. So let me conclude by saying that as people of faith, God is calling us to face reality, to confess complicity, to grieve over our losses and irreversible mistakes, and to imagine a different future. A future in which we give our lives to creating a new story, in which diverse people unite in common cause, generate a defiant and undefeatable hope, persist in seeking reconciliation with all of God's creation. And by responding to God's call in these ways, we will be embracing God's dream. Thank you.